Thank you, dear colleagues and dear friends. It is an incredible pressure to be here today. You cannot imagine how the reputation of the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies casts a wonderful shadow that goes far beyond Alberta and far beyond Canada. So I am very honored and very touched to be here today and to be able to see the Institute a bit later after my talk. But I'm also very happy to be here because I'm here to present my book, a book that took me a very long time to write, and a book that is a Canadian baby because it's a book published by the University of Toronto Press. So I am doubly happy to be here in Canada. And today I'm going to be telling you in particular about this book, but maybe later we can talk more about the connections between the kinds of issues that are raised by this book and the challenges that Ukraine is facing today. Now let me first remind you that unfortunately I'm a political scientist, so there's going to be a couple of arrows in my slides and a couple of concepts that may sound a little bit abstract, but all of this can be applied to understand the challenges facing Ukraine today, certainly. And let me warn you that this book is not only about Ukraine, but that's fine. Because when we look at Ukraine in comparison, if we look at Ukraine not only in terms of a closed system, but when we look at it in terms of how does it compare with other post-Soviet states, Lithuania, Belarus, in the case of this book, then we do two things. We understand better what Ukraine is experiencing, the challenges, but we also open the doors for bringing other people into Ukrainian studies. We show other people how looking at the Ukrainian case can also enrich the research agenda as political scientists, historians, or sociologists. So even if you are not so interested in Lithuania and Belarus, you may have to hear a little bit, just a little bit about these countries. But there is a reason for that. And ultimately, putting our research in Ukraine, on Ukraine, also in a comparative context, can strengthen our field. As I said, I'm very happy that this book came out because it was a huge challenge to do it. It was a huge challenge time-wise. It took me more than 10 years to write this book and to get it published and to correct the 942 footnotes. It was a huge challenge because of having to conduct research in 4 countries, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Russia, using 4 or 5 languages, Lithuanian in translation, but also Russian and German. And obviously a tremendous challenge because energy politics are really the least transparent aspect of the economy of these states. So you have to be very savvy about doing your research. And you have to be very careful about how you do your research. And that's a little bit a different situation or a different methodology than if you are studying maybe administrative reform or agriculture, or maybe not. Maybe we have somebody here who can tell us about the challenges of working on those areas. So the project for this book started with an itch. An itch that perhaps, speaking on March 12, 2014, seems politically incorrect. But it started with an itch, with a feeling that there was something that was bothering me when people simply spoke about the use of the Russian energy weapon. So people spoke about the Russian energy weapon in the year 2000, in the year 2006, in the year 2009, in the year 2014. Yes, the Russian energy weapon, and Russia uses the energy weapon, okay, and then what? The itch or the discomfort was that, yes, there was a lot of talk about the Russian energy weapon, but it was, in a sense, an excuse not to look deeper. Are we just going to talk about the Russian energy weapon and just lay down on our couches? And we need to look deeper. So there was something inside me that told me we need to look deeper. Because if you simply look at energy relations from that perspective, you are missing a lot in the picture. So a lot of the research that has been done until now on this area is concentrating on one side of the question, the supply process. Russia supplying energy or not supplying energy or stopping the supply of energy, Russia supplying at a high price or at a low price, Russia, Russia, Russia doing. Okay, that's fine, but is it simply this kind of picture? Is it simply a picture of Russian policies, Russian imperialism, Russian attack through the energy weapon? Okay, but then what? What else is there? So my concern with that kind of perspective is that it tended to see energy as a kind of undifferentiated whole that can be used as a weapon by the state for political purposes. Now, I am not denying that Russia has used or continues to use energy for political purposes. But there were two problems. There are two problems when you take that kind of perspective and simply stay there, remain there. The first problem has to do with the fact that this assumes there is no differentiation of actors within Russia. Okay? So that's already something that one needs to look at. But secondly, the idea here, if you simply are talking about a Russian energy weapon, is that you're assuming that those states which are subject to Russia's use of energy as a weapon, those energy-dependent states that have inherited from the Soviet period economic dependencies, industrial organizational dependencies, infrastructural dependencies, that those states are simply subjects of Russian policy without the ability to do policy, to have agency. How many decades, how many even centuries have Ukrainians, and in this century, in the last century, those of us in Ukrainian studies struggled and fought against the idea of Ukraine as simply a subject of history. Yet when we were talking about energy policy or the use of energy as a weapon, we were kind of simply assuming that the dependent states were just empty vessels receiving not only that energy, but whatever designs Russia had. And that made me unhappy. I knew we had to look deeper, and I knew we had to look at what was happening not simply in terms of the supply process, but what was happening in the consumer country, in the energy-dependent country. And that is where the idea for this book was born, many years ago. So this is the result after 10 or 12 years after that idea came. So the first thing I learned by doing this research, and let me just remind you that the book is covering the period 1991 to 2013, so the first 20+ years of independent or re-independent statehood for 3 post-Soviet states, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. So when I started to look at the development of energy policies in these states, trying to understand what were the domestic conditions. So when I try to say, okay, it's not simply about how much Russia is using that energy weapon, but what is happening domestically in these states. The first thing I found out was that, yes, we talk about dependency and 99% dependency on Russia, or 60%, or 87%. We are talking about geographical dependency or geographic diversification in terms of the sources of that energy. But the first thing I learned by doing my research on this book is that it is not enough to simply talk about geographic diversification. And there are a couple of reasons for this. It's not simply enough to say, oh, if we receive all the energy from Russia, this is bad. If we receive some from Russia and some from elsewhere, this is better. It is better, but that's not the end of the question. If you look at the case of the history of Ukrainian energy relations, we have tremendous set of issues having to do with Ukraine's diversification to Turkmenistan, with many, many problems involved in that relationship and opportunities for corruption. But what I most importantly learned about the limits of looking simply in terms of geographic diversification is that it neglects, or it stops us from thinking about two other types of diversification, which are also important. Energy source diversification, whether you are depending on gas, oil, coal, something else, atomic power. And most important for our discussion today, it prevents us from thinking about, for example, contractual diversification. Okay? This is a kind of concept that I bring into this book that is not in the previous literature, contractual diversification. What does that mean? It means that even if you are talking about supplies from a single country, you may use a variety of contractual mechanisms in bringing that energy to your country. Most crudely, we could talk about short-term contracts, long-term contracts. We can also talk about the governance aspects of those contracts. And that is a key issue that helps us explain many of the things that happened in Ukraine or did not happen in Ukraine. For those of you who are also interested in the European Union side of the question, you may know that issues of contractual diversification are key to the European Union now and are key to the case, the judicial case that the European Union has opened against Gazprom. I don't know how many of you have followed that 2 years ago, the European Union opened a judicial case against Gazprom having to do with Gazprom's abuse of market power in several energy-dependent countries in the region, including Lithuania. And this is also tied to very important questions about whether the price of gas that should be charged these countries should be based on the oil quotation. I think you all live in Alberta, so probably you know a lot about the oil quotation. Quote. So this is the first thing I learned, that you have to look not only at geographic diversification, it's important, absolutely, but you need to look at also contractual diversification, and you need to look at what happens domestically in these states. And that's exactly what I did. I spent a year in Ukraine doing research, several months in Lithuania, several months in Belarus, a semester in Russia. And I tried to understand what were the domestic elements of this dealing with energy dependency. And when you start looking at the domestic side of the question, then you start looking at things like not only how much energy a country is importing from Russia, but who are the winners and losers, not only of the fact that the country is importing from Russia or from elsewhere, but of the concrete ways in which this trade is organized, contractually or otherwise. You look at issues of governance and transparency, or lack of. You look at situations where there is hijacking of state policy, where there is kind of a state policy, but that policy has been hijacked by particular actors. These are all domestic political issues, which until now very few scholars have looked at, because it's messy, it's difficult. Yes, I know, so what? Has to be done. So I started looking at what we could call the black box of those energy-dependent states. If you remember a previous slide, we had that black box there. And looking at this is also interesting from a more theoretical perspective, from the perspective of political science and political economy. I'm sure there's not many people here interested in political economy, but those of you who are, and those of you who benefit from the oil quotation in Alberta, perhaps are familiar with some of the literature out there about rentier states. States is a literature that developed especially to deal with the cases of the Middle East, countries dependent largely on the export of oil. And there's a whole literature about what happens when you have a state that depends not on taxing its citizens, but on oil export revenue. So we have a lot of discussions that, but until now, we had never understood that those kind of situations may also affect energy-dependent states. So a second contribution of this book is that it tells us, excuse me, we can actually talk about a situation of rents, energy rents, in a situation of dependency. Normally, everybody talks about energy only in the case of the energy-rich states, and about energy profits in the case of energy-rich states. But what I discovered and it was not very difficult to discover because it's very obvious when you start reading the local materials, is that you could also make very huge profits, even in situations of energy poorness, of energy dependency. And that's where the book starts to talk about rents of energy dependency, profits and rents that emerge in a situation of energy dependency, and what was most important for me, how those rents then take a life of their own and start circulating in the political system. So this is where this idea, I'm sorry, I'm getting lost here, yes. The idea comes of the cycle of rents within this system. Now, where are these rents coming from? Okay, so we have a table in the book where I talk about some of the places where these rents may come from. These can be external rents. And again, if we're talking about the rentier state literature, that's mainly what this rentier state literature, which anyway was developed to talk about the energy-rich states, talks about. Those external rents, in the case of the energy-poor states, may come from simple things like transit fees charged, let's say, to Russia, or the fees charged for gas storage in underground gas storage. You probably know that Ukraine has some of the largest underground gas storages in Europe. But they may also come from other things. For example, from what we call arbitrage gains that may arise when you have significant price differentials between the price of energy in different markets or sub-markets. Let's say if you had a situation where gas was being produced in Russia for $10 per 1,000 cubic meters, sold to Ukraine for $50 per 1,000 cubic meters, and then sold at the German border for $300. So these are three different prices, three different sub-markets, and you can make a big profit getting gas at one price and selling it perhaps illegally in the other market. Okay, so these are some examples of external rents, but you also have different ways in which you can accrue rents, energy rents in a situation of energy dependency internally. For example, and here the case of Ukraine gives us many, many examples, you can have a situation, a similar situation to those different prices in different sub-markets. You have that when you have domestic subsidization. And we have many examples of that in the case of Ukraine, where gas that was earmarked to be sold to one type of consumers at a subsidized price was actually used by well-placed actors and resold at a higher price. You may have domestic rents from the profits made by intermediary companies. I'm sure the word Rosukrenergo rings a bell for many of you here, or Uraltransgas earlier. You can have internal rents simply from unique arrangements like Zaliki, IOU arrangements, where you are getting an offset or a barter mechanism in very good terms, or simply by stealing from the state. We have so many examples of companies, in the case of Ukraine, simply using state guarantees for the importation of gas and then not paying and the state having to pay, especially in the mid-1990s. So there are many ways in which you can accrue rents in a situation of energy dependency. And what I end up doing in much of this book is by looking at what happens with those rents within the political system. So how are they extracted? Are they external rents? Are they internal rents from domestic consumers which are being exploited, or from Russia, or from another place? What is the source of these rents? I looked at how are they distributed. Who are these rents going to? Are they going to a broad set of players? Are they going to companies? Are they going to individuals? Are they going to a smaller group of people? And finally, I look at how these rents are reincorporated into the political system or recycled. What do they produce politically? Do they produce a situation where You have certain actors which become very rich, but cannot sustain that after they lose the contact with the source of rents, or do they produce a type of political system? So I was looking, in the case of the 3 countries I studied, what happens with these energy rents. My original interest in writing this book was trying to explain how 3 post-Soviet states, which saw their situation change virtually overnight from being part of a union-wide energy system in an energy-rich state and suddenly become energy-poor states and independent transit players. Originally, I wanted to understand their energy policy. How do we explain their different energy policies? But what I ended up finding out is that looking at this side of the question not only helps you understand those different energy policies or lack of, but also helped me understand how those political systems developed, how those rents became reincorporated into the system, supporting certain political actors, supporting certain political dynamics. And remember, we are talking about the first 20 years of independent statehood or re-independent statehood of these states, foundational years for these states. So whatever is happening in these years is going to have a very important impact above and beyond that initial period. So what did I find out? I think you should read the book, but in a very short summary, I found out that the way those rents worked in the 3 countries I studied was different. They were extracted in different ways. In some cases, they were much larger than in other cases. For example, in the case of Lithuania, for a variety of reasons, those rents per capita were much lower than in the case of Belarus or Ukraine. And that has to do with a variety of reasons, not only with Lithuania's geographical situation, but also with certain policies. I found out that those rents went to different types of actors. In these 3 cases, for example, in the case of Ukraine, they were very concentrated in a small number of very powerful and economically mighty actors. In the case of Lithuania, for example, they were a little bit more broadly distributed, as in the case of Belarus. And I also found out that it was in the cases of Ukraine and Belarus where they had the longer lasting impact on their political system. So this is kind of the summary of the differences I found in those states. I'm going to jump a couple of slides because I want to tell you something else. I will come back to this in a moment. Okay, one moment. Okay. Yes. This book is about Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. And I'm very proud that this book is about these 3 states because if it's one thing that I have tried to do in my academic career is to look at post-Soviet processes from a non-Moscow perspective, to look at the political economy of the post-Soviet area from a non-Moscow perspective. People don't do that. People don't like to do that because it takes a lot of work. I'm so sorry. Yes, it does. So what? And indeed, this is a book that looks very deeply at these 3 states. But I also learned a lot about Russia by writing this book. I learned a lot about Russia in terms of the role that is played by different energy actors within Russia. I also understood that it's not enough to look at Russia as a unitary actor. It's not enough to look at Russia simply as an external actor. I saw many examples of situations where, in contrast with our usual way of thinking of energy policy at a state level, you had coalitions of actors across borders. I have 2 or 3 examples from the Ukrainian case, for example, where you had one set of actors in Ukraine, for example, when Yulia Tymoshenko was first Vice Prime Minister for Energy, with one particular calculation even of Ukraine's debt to Russia, in coalition with certain actors within Gazprom, and then another coalition around Mr. Boyko, her arch enemy, and some actors in Russia. So actors across borders, not enough to look simply at Russia also as a single actor. we also saw this in the case of Lithuania, with some battles for control within Russia also spilling out to Lithuania. But the most important thing I learned by looking at the Russian case is that energy can be used as a weapon. It is a weapon, but energy has many different uses for different actors, especially within the Russian case. Energy can be used as a chain of influence in the relationship between oligarchs and the state. It can be used to appease domestic constituencies. It can be used to enrich particular oligarchs. It can be used in many, many different ways, of which the external use of energy as a weapon is only one use. So again, I'm not saying that Russia has not used energy as a weapon. There's no doubt that it has, and it does, and it will do perhaps. But I'm saying you have to understand that this takes place within a much broader context in which energy is used for many, many, many different reasons by different actors. Of course, the reason you're here today probably is not because you're interested in political science, but because you're interested in Ukraine and because you're interested in this very key moment in Ukraine's life. So how can the framework provided by this book help us understand the challenges facing Ukraine today? To a certain extent, Ukraine today is in a different situation than the key period discussed by this book, which is a period when there were very key, very big price differentials between the price paid by Ukraine, for example, the price for gas, and the prices paid by Germany. And those price differentials allowed certain types of corruption to go on. I refer to that period as the classic golden age of energy rents, and I deal with that period in more detail in a previous book, Energy Dependency, Politics and Corruption, 2008, paperback 2012. So even when that classic period of golden period of rents of energy dependency is not there, energy corruption continues, and continues in unusual ways. Now, after the change of regime, we have seen many interesting information coming out about, for example, a company called VTech, Mr. Kirchenko. And we see that even in a situation where gas prices increased, energy corruption was possible in part because of the different prices charged domestically to different users. And we also know that some corrupt actors in Ukraine were actually engaged in the importation of gas, not from Russia, but from Central Europe. So it tells you that the things are much more complicated than they may seem at first, and that corruption continues. The second thing I learned is that today we have a very problematic situation for Ukraine in ways that go above and beyond the physical or territorial threat presented by Russia. The Euromaidan revolution was made by people who dreamed of a new Ukraine. Not only of a Ukraine that would have signed an association agreement with the European Union, not only of a Ukraine without Yanukovych, but of a Ukraine without corruption, of a Ukraine without oligarchs. And today, that Ukraine finds itself under military territorial pressure from Russia, who is there for the new government to seek support from? Okay, did I hear oligarchs? Yes. Okay, did I hear, or do you remember some of the declarations of some of these people after the events? We are going to rally together to support Ukraine. That's very good. Ukraine would have very little chance of survival without that support, but it tells us that we have a very paradoxical situation. And when I look back at the title of my book, Ukraine, between, or rather, these countries between domestic oligarchs and Russian pressure, that paradox is more real today than ever. And that is something that we should be thinking about. And the second thing that I think we should be thinking about that helps us understand the current situation is, of course, can this person bring a solution to Ukraine? Either through being an intermediary in negotiations with Putin or by coming back to the government. And when I think of that, it reminds me not only of this book, but of this previous book, which looks in extreme detail at different ways in which you could engage in energy corruption during the golden years. And it looks very closely at the situation in Ukraine during the period of Prime Minister Lazarenko. I don't know how many of you remember Prime Minister Lazarenko, 1996, 1997, and who basically tried to turn Ukraine into a one energy company country to monopolize energy rents in a way that threatened other actors, including President Kuchma. And that tells me we have to be very careful when we expect particular players to be able to solve the situation now in a more positive way, because they're also part of that previous system. More broadly, we have learned that corruption issues continue to be key. The danger of energy corruption and other corruption in Ukraine continues to be there even after the new government has been put in place. If we are dreaming or hoping that the new government will be able to solve Ukraine's predicaments and problems, please take a deeper look at the people who have been named to different positions. Take a deeper look at the temptation that is present by possibilities for energy corruption or other corruption which are still there. And similarly, when we look with great expectation and great hope at what the shale gas revolution and unconventional gas and oil revolution could bring Ukraine, let's remember January 2013, $50 billion agreement between the government of Ukraine and ExxonMobil for the development of shale gas. Let's remember that under the ground factors, such as whether there is shale gas or there isn't shale gas, whether we have the technology or do not have the technology, are not enough. Even with those reserves there, what happens above the ground, what happens at the level of governance, at the level of control of corruption, that is going to be key for Ukraine's ability to benefit from these resources in a way that will actually benefit the country. So I would love you to read the book, but of course you don't need to buy it. You can even read it in Google Books, or you can get a free review copy from the University of Toronto Press. They're very generous. And finally, I want to thank the many institutions in the US, in Germany, in Finland, what else? Yes, European Union, who supported this project. It was very, very expensive to write this book. And it took me a lot of effort to get all that funding, but I can assure you that it was worth it. And I'm eager to have some words from our discussant and also a broader discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Balmaceda. Now, to help us lead off the discussion, we have Dr. Robert Murray, who comes to us all the way from the Tory building. And he is the Vice President, Research at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. He's also an Adjunct Professor of Political Science at the University of Alberta, a Senior Fellow of Security and Defense Policy at the Atlantic Institute of Market Studies, and a Research Fellow at the University of Alberta's European Union Center of Excellence. He's also a contributing editor at E-International Relations and a columnist for Troy Media. And he has written books on Syria, Libya, and on international relations generally. Dr. Murray.
Thank you very much. It was interesting, and thank you, first of all, to the organizers for allowing me to be part of this. One of the great emails I received when the advertisement went out is, how is somebody with the last name of Murray commenting at the Center of Ukraine Studies event? So it's kind of an ironic thing for me to be here. But it's a real pleasure for me, and I know that I have a political science background as well. So for those of you that are not big fans of political science, this is going to be equally as challenging for you. And I apologize in advance. I want to start by saying that I know that as a political scientist, one of the big fears in writing a book at any time is that your book takes time to go through press, and once it gets published, things have changed and it suddenly becomes irrelevant. But I somehow don't think that's going to be the case here whatsoever. This is absolutely one of the most pivotal contributions to scholarship on this particular area of study in recent memory. And I think that there's a lot more here as Margarita's presentation really demonstrated, which is that there are some very key questions more broadly to not only post-Soviet states, but the international system in general, as well as parsing down into the specific energy policies of states. And from the outset, I think I was immediately struck by the fact that this book asks three pivotal questions that are important for all of us when we take a look at what goes on in the world, not just in the post-Soviet sphere, but elsewhere. Number one being, how is national interest developed under conditions of political transition? Secondly, how is national interest and how does it affect policy at the local level? And also, how is national interest constructed politically? Now, these are fairly broad questions, of course, that Margarita then parses down into the specific content of the book, but this is certainly not unique to the geographical area in which she's focused the book itself. These questions have been posed by scholars looking at transition in Africa, post-intervention states. Right now we're currently looking at some of these questions through Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, etc. So this book poses some very pivotal questions that we are confronted with on a regular basis about the world around us. And of course they are particularly relevant in the context of what is currently occurring in Ukraine, which I know will be discussed after I get off the stage very quickly. More generally, the book examines the challenges of nation building in the wake of the Cold War through the lens of three case studies, of course, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, focusing on what the author refers to, and I quote, one of the most central policy challenges facing them during the first two decades of their independent statehood, being how to deal with their overwhelming energy dependency on Russia. And of course, the case that gets made in this book and what gets built on is that this dependency and these political issues extend far beyond the energy sector. But of course, the energy sector becomes a key policy tool, not only from the Russian perspective and as a tool of coercion, but also one of the most interesting contributions of the book, I think, are the individual case studies and the fact that this book puts onus on those three individual states as to how they individually have dealt with the issue of energy politics and energy dependency, and how those reactions have also fostered their relationships with Russia moving forward, and of course is something that is particularly relevant right now. I would say that the book wisely departs from some of the polemic in the past in trying to avoid developing a grand theory, which tries to lump all post-Soviet states in together, but rather examines the domestic level variables in the three states that comprise the case studies, and interestingly reveals unique aspects in each that help to develop or help explain ongoing energy dependency on Russia, but also the seeming lack of interest from each state in overcoming that dependency, which is part of that onus that is highlighted in the book, a fairly essential contribution. Though, of course, the inability or the lack of desire in overcoming some of that dependency is likely to change based on recent events over the last month. The structure of the book itself lends itself well to the initial arguments posed by the author, but of course, focusing on the post-Soviet era legacy in the energy sector, but also how the Soviet legacy influenced the policy decisions of each of these three states differently. So not only how Russia dealt with each state on its own policy agenda, but how each of these three states responded in that tit-for-tat relationship back and forth over a 20-year plus span that has now influenced how current outcomes are being perceived and understood. And of course, while I'm talking about the book structure, I should note that it's extraordinarily easy to follow and accessible, considering the fact that, as Margarita alluded to, the study can be very messy, very difficult, but I think that credit is due where credit is deserved, in the sense that this is far more than just a difficult study. It was that itch that is referred to in the initial presentation led to, I think, a series of very complex questions, and being able to parse down into something logically cogent would not have been a very easy task, but this book certainly meets that very well. The commentary on Russia's domestic political situation is incredibly valuable for two reasons, I would say. First, to recognizing the important shift from being energy importer, energy exporter, and some of the intricacies of Russia's own energy struggles in the post-Cold War era. But second, and I think more importantly, to better understand the internal issues plaguing Russia's ability to grow and diversify its own energy markets. And if I can be so bold as to pose perhaps one critique of the book itself, it would have been the fact that I think it would have been valuable to see on a more comprehensive basis how Russia's policy towards each of these three countries really impacted that relationship. Because, of course, it's incredibly difficult in lumping one chapter on Russia's domestic situation and how that domestic situation related to those three countries. And because it's such a broad element, I think it would have deserved almost a chapter on each, to really understand that reactionary purpose from each of those three countries. Because as you alluded to in your opening presentation even, I think what's important is that there are a number of consequences for Russia itself that are posed by some of these questions and looking at those three case studies, and some of those things that Russia is currently struggling with and will continue to struggle with moving forward. And really, in order to understand those relationships and the interplay back and forth, I think that would have been really a fascinating contribution and something perhaps that could be looked at in your next book, which I'm quite looking forward to. Not to put any undue pressure on you for something new. And also, again, referring earlier to the so-called messy and difficult nature of this book, there is an element of note that I want to make, which is the meticulous research conducted. This is an enormous scholarly undertaking, which is why that when you look at the book itself, I admit to, when I got it off the shelf, it was incredibly daunting to take a look at the size of this book. But when you actually parse through it, over half of this book in terms of page count is the research. And the valuable part of this, of course, is the fact that the individual case studies from each of the three countries was taken on the ground, primary research, linguistic challenges, all of which really lead to the valuable product of the book itself. But you are to be commended for that level of research, I think, because I think I would have given up at the itch if I was you. Now, evaluating some of the book's key arguments and conclusions, and letting me return the floor to our guest. First of all, of course, one of the key questions of the book, one of the key contentions of the book, was that domestic institutions matter in the management of energy dependency. I think what's important to note here is that this is, of course, discussed quite comprehensively, places particular onus on the role of the executive in all three of the individual states and how the uniqueness of each of those three executives have influenced the outcomes that we see in those relationships. Not just the way that those executives behave with Moscow, but also how they behave within their own executive structure, within their own legislative structure, or whatever it may be within those given states. And the importance of understanding each of those executives on their own merits. The fact that this is not just an institutional discussion, but domestic attitudes also matter. The idea of popular movement, the idea of domestic norms, political norms, as each state not only developed its own post-Soviet identity, but also attempted and struggled with creating a post-Soviet policy base through which to be able to interact with the world around it outside of Moscow. Those domestic attitudes also impact the behavior with Russia, and the comprehension of energy policy become incredibly important among domestic populace. So the perception of Russia, the perception of other neighboring states, to influence the imperative of needing to diversify energy policy away from Russia as time went on, and it was very clear that some of these tools were being used for coercive purposes. The second key argument of the book, of course, of who benefits from patterns of energy trade, will have long-term political effects. Naturally, I would say that most political decisions are made according to really a cost-benefit analysis. And in the cases of the three states chosen for this study, this logic would continue to hold true. But of course, what's important is not seeing these three or other post-Soviet states as a monolith. Each has their own unique cost-benefit analyses that they need to work through in order for developing their own policy agendas, regardless of the similarities in history. The availability of large-scale energy rents in the formative years immediately after the Soviet Union's collapse clearly made energy dependency a natural policy decision until the late 2000s, when costs began to greatly outweigh benefits, both in terms of financial calculations and political institutions. As the book notes, in the last 5 years, as Ukraine has updated or closed down many of its creaky factories and mining operations, according to the Washington Post. Its natural gas consumption has fallen by nearly 40%, and its gas imports from Russia have dropped by half. Gazprom is struggling to hold on to its market share, and we see that, of course, this influences current decisions, current outcomes, as situations in that region continue to persist. And so I think weighing the book on the two arguments that the author sets out to demonstrate, not only are they proven effectively through the book itself, but empirical evidence and in recent memory certainly reinforces some of these claims. I would leave with 4 further thoughts of my own that stem from the impressions that I was left with in reading the book. Firstly, that Russia's approach to energy clearly has been an essential component of their post-Soviet Union foreign policy. The concerns raised in the book about the cunning abilities Russia has displayed to prevent institutionalization or its neighboring states, combined with really de facto sanctions, as the book notes, demonstrates Russia's soft power approach to maintaining a sphere of influence after the Cold War's end, something that is eerily reminiscent and eerily relevant in the modern world. As recent events have shown, the manipulation of former Soviet republics has profound implications for the domestic political interests that are at the core of this book's analysis. Resentment and fear become the core values of Russian relations rather than seeing Russia as a legitimate trading partner. And those perceptions of Moscow, and not just the political institutions, but oligarchs, elites, and business elites as well, has impacted, I think, some of that Russian foreign policy, and that will have, of course, impacts moving forward. And the book reminds us of this. Secondly, I would note the European Union's disinterest, and I think this was a particularly key point of the book as well in that European Union discussion. The European Union's disinterest in effectively engaging with Russia served in many cases to negatively impact post-Soviet states. The EU, on one hand, has spent considerable effort to establish itself as a pillar of trade liberalization and fair practice, but its lack of energy policy and also its lack of mentorship to post-Soviet republics has really facilitated the conditions under which Russia is able to take full advantage of those states and also take advantage of the EU as well, if modern politics are any example. Though, again, as the book highlights, there is onus on these states themselves. The complexities of that EU-Russia energy relationship are in full view currently, as the EU is attempting to find ways of deterring Russian action without provoking Russia out of fear that the Russians may halt energy exports. And as such, the EU has proven itself, in my mind anyway, and I think as the book would reinforce, ineffective as a counterbalance to Russia's role in the energy sector thus far. Thirdly, the role of elites in post-Soviet states cannot be understated. In some cases, the elite control of political decision-making has led to a series of disastrous decisions that really serve the interests of the elites themselves. And I think that the research done, and that in-depth level of research in tracing the elites themselves, who are the key players, who are their own power network, and how are their decisions influenced, and who are they influencing with their own elite status, become very important. It's also worth noting, I think, is that what I would call the cross-saturation of elites and domestic political institutions, where billionaires also sit in parliament, in some cases, and help influence policy outcomes, becomes incredibly important as well. So that cross-saturation, it's very difficult to separate the idea of elites, oligarchs, and political institutions themselves when we start to see them combining. And those accusations, of course, of corruption and conflict of interest are highly prevalent in energy policy, and where this becomes also relevant. And the last thought that I would leave you with before returning the floor would be that the author notes the limitations of a domestic level analysis in explaining the wider consequences to energy dependency and possible policy alternatives. I would agree that there certainly are limits on that domestic perspective that really fail to take into account that regional issue, that international issue, because this is really, as much as these decisions are in many ways, as I said, a tit-for-tat discussion with the Russians, there's also far larger consequences in other bodies, other organizations that are at play here. And I think that also have impacted those three states individually. However, what is of great value in this book is what I would call a sophisticated presentation of the four cases, really, the three case study states and Russia as well. And so what I would see lacking in that domestic level perspective is the greater context in which all of these states have been operating since the end of the Cold War. For instance, understanding the EU's approach to energy becomes essential in helping to understand Russia's motivations and the responses of other former Soviet republics. I would also add that there may be value in recognizing Russia's emphasis on energy as part of a wider commentary on things like NATO expansion and some of the paranoia surrounding that, an eroding and seemingly re-emerging now sphere of influence, and helping to explain some of Russia's behavior in the Arctic region as well, primarily based on the fact that so much of Russia's Arctic strategy is predicated on this perceived rhetorical need for greater energy resources. And so the energy relations with its neighboring states, I think, also impact Russia's perception of the need, or the aggressive need, to have to seek other energy markets and energy resources moving forward. So I would conclude with the fact that this book really could not be more timely if it had tried. And the commentary and predictions included in the book seem to have very quickly come to fruition. It was a real pleasure for me to be able to read. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much for your comments, and of course, since they are largely positive, I can only thank you. But there are several elements there which I certainly will be paying a lot of attention in the future. I don't know if I will write another book exactly like this. There's another book in the making, a little bit different. But there are key issues there which I really want to be thinking about. For example, the connection we're making now with Arctic issues. Maybe we can talk later about that, and how that larger Russian energy strategy based on certain perceived needs, perceived security needs, perceived economic needs. That's something that certainly deserves a lot of attention and thought, which has not been there in this book, but certainly I will be thinking about in the future.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Murray. Now we can have general discussion, and if anybody is unwilling to come forward, I have a sheaf of notes from when I read the book, and I've got some questions myself, so there shouldn't be any lack of questions and discussion. Please, anybody? Yes, at the back.
Thank you
Mr. Graves?
In writing the book, did you come to any kind of motivation for presenting this case based on your itch? Was it the fact that you wanted to diversify the participation in the energy markets? Was it the fact that you wanted more national, as a government, the interaction realistic, or the influence of, say the private sector, ExxonMobil? How do these various players weigh into your kind of thinking as you were?
I think I need to ask you to perhaps restate the question, because I lost a little bit at the beginning. And
so what were you hoping for as a result of your research? Were you hoping that the oligarchs would become more, to be more of them, so that the energy policy would be more distributed, or would the government would be more relevant in terms of their interaction with energy? Or were you hoping that perhaps the private sector, like ExxonMobil or something like that, would all of a sudden come to the plate?
Okay. Well, if you talk about hope, I mean, my only hope when I was writing this book was that I would one day finish writing it and that it would be published, which I had very serious doubt about this for about 10 of those 12 years. But more seriously speaking, of course, this is more an analysis than policy recommendation. But what I really think is that people need to look at the facts to be able to deal with the present and with the future. Every time I look at a situation with Ukraine that tells me, oh my God, this already happened in the year 2000. Why is this happening again in the year 2012 or 2013? Then I think not only those oligarchs should be looking back at the ways in which they were able to make money 10 years ago, but also societies need to engage in a serious reflection on what have been the patterns not only of trade, but of the engagement of different economic actors. And unfortunately, that reflection is not taking place. Unfortunately, we have very little research coming from these countries themselves dealing with this issue. In part because it is a dangerous topic. And some people even argue that Mr. Gonzalez's troubles in the year 2000 had something to do with energy politics. But in part because of economic pressures and day-to-day pressures make it very difficult for some of the very well-qualified people in the ground to engage in a deep research and discussion of these issues. So if there was one hope, and there still is that these three societies, and in particular Ukrainian society, looks back at what have been the lessons of the successes and failures of organizing the relationship between economic actors in the state and the state in the first 22 years of independence. And of course, speaking of March 12, 2014, this couldn't be more important.
Yes, David?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a simple question, really. Well, two questions. First of all, why did you choose Lithuania? And does it have its own domestic oligarchs? And second, do you see nuclear power playing the same kind of role as oil and gas in these equations, particularly given Russia's new power plant building program in Kaliningrad and Belarus and other places?
Yes. Why did I choose Lithuania? Well, sadly, I spent about 2 or 3 years choosing. I mean, this is embarrassing. That's why it's good to be a professor. You theoretically have time. Nobody cares if you finish your books. I spent several years choosing the case studies. And I wanted to have a variety of states, but that had a significant level of dependency on Russia. I was deciding between Lithuania and Latvia. I ended up choosing Lithuania because in the case of Latvia, you have another factor which is very interesting, but which may complicate the issue too much, and that was the role of the Russian-speaking minority, which is very interesting, but perhaps it would have taken a little bit of attention. So I had a conversation with a wonderful colleague and scholar, maybe you know her, Oksana Shevel, from the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and Tufts University, and then she just told me, take Lithuania, and I did, and I'm very happy that I did. Lithuania also is important because when you're looking at the case of Belarus, if you look at the Russian energy policy, Lithuania plays a certain role there. So that was very useful from that perspective. Also personally, if you're involved in Belarusian research, as I am, and David is, of course, and we are very happy that your latest book just came out on Belarus and the memory of the Second World War and Lukashenko. It's very good. It's very convenient as well. So that's why I chose Lithuania. And the second question was about nuclear power. So nuclear power is there, but it's kind of subsumed under gas. Of course, nuclear power, it doesn't come from gas, but both gas and nuclear power produce electricity, so in a sense, they are part of the same broadly conceived value chain. Nuclear power is there very clearly when we talk about some of the challenges those states faced immediately after independence. We had a situation where these states had been part of a unified energy system, and those states that had nuclear facilities, Ukraine, Lithuania, and this was especially important in the case of Lithuania, had nuclear facilities meant to supply a region that went well beyond their borders as republics of the Soviet Union. In the case of Lithuania, even beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. And when those states become independent in 1991, you have a very interesting situation where a state like Lithuania has those facilities, but it doesn't really have control of those facilities. Doesn't, as I tell my students, it's like the Soviet Union dissolved and took the key away, and Lithuania is left with the infrastructure, but without the means to manage the infrastructure. So it's a very interesting example of how those states may deal with those inherited infrastructures. And in the case of Lithuania, concerning their nuclear infrastructure, what I found very, very interesting, and again, it's very interesting in the context of the challenges facing Ukraine today and the Crimea, Lithuania's nuclear power station was located in a town which was largely Russian-speaking. The people who worked in this nuclear power station were largely Russian speakers, and the first thing Lithuania did was to reassure them that they were welcome as full citizens of Lithuania, which they were already citizens, that they would be supported, and as I know, even those workers were paid even more than the Minister of Energy in Vilnius. So there was a counter-offensive as well. So regaining control, or taking real control over that infrastructure, meant not simply gaining physical control of the asset, not only redoing power chains that formerly had gone through Moscow and those all-union ministries, and not to Vilnius, but it required also a counter-offensive. And in this case, Lithuania was able to do this successfully. Of course, later on, they had to close that nuclear power plant because of European Union issues. But again, it tells us also that energy issues are not only about infrastructure, they're not only about change of power, but they're also about control. Sometimes a cultural offensive.
Bogdana?
Yeah, I have, I guess, two questions. Maybe the seizure of Crimea, how much does energy issues or energy factors play in this takeover? And the second question, if you have time, is Yanukovych and his family. Was there any conflict between the oligarchs in Ukraine and Yanukovych family that is related to energy politics internally?
Absolutely. Yes. So the first question about Crimea. I cannot pretend to know the ultimate reasons for the Russian intervention in Crimea. I'm sure it's a mixture of many reasons. In my personal view, there was an opening there that could be exploited. I don't think the energy factor is the most important factor, but there are two energy elements here. One element has to do with Ukraine's shale gas deposits and gas deposits in the Black Sea seabed, and that is within the larger area of Crimea. A second energy element has to do with Russia's own goals of building a South Stream gas pipeline that would allow Russia to, again, avoid transit through Ukraine or reduce transit to Ukraine. And should Crimea become a part of the Russian Federation, this could perhaps allow for a changing of that route, if that's still possible, I don't know, and that would shorten that route and make it cheaper. So this would be two energy elements of the Crimean situation. I'm actually working on a paper on the energy elements of the crisis. It's not only about geopolitics or about Crimea, but it's about the domestic, of course, as well as external elements of the crisis. Concerning the second question, Yanukovych family energy. Very, 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 very important. And again, when we think about looking back at history and what we have learned from history, and the situation in late 2013, 2012 reminded me very much of the situation in 1996, 1997. We talked briefly about then Prime Minister Pavlo Lazarenko, and how he got into a situation where he tried to turn Ukraine away from the model of a balancing between different interest groups or different regionally located clans, or as I like to call them, business administrative groups, trying to turn that into a situation where his own energy company was monopolizing rents from all of Ukraine. In that case, we know how this ended. This ended with a huge increase in economic violence and certain very high-profile killings around this period. It ended with Prime Minister Lazarenko being forced to resign. It ended with Yulia Tymoshenko taking his role, she was number 2 in this company, and remaking herself as a transparency fighter. But it also ended with President Kushma. And this is very well discussed in the little book. I call that the mini book. Yes. President Kuchma trying to create a system by which no longer one player could control energy rents. And it led to a variety of other events, including the creation of Naftogaz Ukraine. The point is, why am I talking about 1996 when we want to talk about 2013, 2014? Because what we had in 2013 was a situation, again, where that perhaps even natural, if you wish, balance between different geographic business administrative groups in Ukraine was unbalanced by the tremendous role played now not only by one economic actor, but by one economic actor with the full support of the president. And this is the Yanukovych family, this is Mr. Kirchenko, this is the company Vetek, and we have a situation where some of the energy profits, energy rents that have been made by a person like Mr. Firtash, Mikhail Firtash, Prosecutor, etc., were being now compromised because Mr. Kirchenko was taking many of those rents. Now, nobody, I don't know about Alberta, but most places I go, nobody has any kind words for Mr. Firtash, but he's feeling, and other oligarchs feeling threatened by this new player, certainly also played a role in making those oligarchs have a little bit more of a balanced position vis-a-vis the events of the Euromaidan. So that's my complicated answer to an easy question.
Harry Nichbor?
Just a question here. You've made reference here to having the governance for the Ukraine being addressing the above-ground issues to continue, as a key challenge. From your analysis, of these three countries and looking at this situation as we understand it here, at least from a Western perspective, that your temporary government that you've got in the Ukraine, as to why they would be focusing more on trying to, for example, as we speak, there's the meeting between the Prime Minister and Obama here to bring in armed forces in to solve the problem, rather than trying to start addressing these above-ground issues with some unifying forces that can basically start bringing, some sort of sense to changing that whole situation with those oligarchs. Because unless that gets changed, you're going to have a continuation. And I don't know what
I cannot offer a solution because we have a very difficult situation right now. This temporary government has a weak hold on the situation outside Kyiv. And we're not talking only about Crimea. This government has sought to increase its control over the situation in the regions by making a number of strategic appointments to some of the governorships, Mr. Taruta, Mr. Kolomievsky, others. It's going to be a challenge to stop, to tell the oligarchs you need to work in a totally different manner, but we still depend on you. So I don't think any of these economic players is going to try very quickly to occupy the schemes that have been vacated by other players. For example, in the last week, we have seen examples from the SBU and so on showing about the crimes or the corruption that Vetek was involved with. These are schemes that could be quickly taken over by other players. I think every economic player in Ukraine now is under heightened scrutiny. So I don't imagine that they will be openly doing something to take over these schemes immediately, but they may try to soon. And it's going to be very hard for the central government to do something about this because it also depends on them politically in the region. So, but if any of you have a solution, please share it with us because it's really a very, very, very key issue that is going to affect Ukraine's development.
Ihor Boroda?
Did you, in your research, come across anything that ties in Russian energy policy to the Iran issue? For example, there's articles being produced on how Russia helped Iran develop a nuclear industry, at the same time helped Iran circumvent embargoes with the main intent being that obviously oil prices will remain high as long as that pot is still boiling. And also keeping Iranian oil from finding a road on a pipeline through Turkey into Europe, and thereby securing Russian markets for Europe and preventing other suppliers from interfering with that. Did you come across
Well, that is a very, very important perspective of the issue. It's a side of the issue that is going to be really, really important as the European Union is trying to diversify its own energy supplies, and as some of those alternatives are not really being pursued because of our own U.S. Reticence to have supplies from Iran. It's not an issue that I specifically encounter in my own research here, but certainly if we're looking at the question in a broader perspective, certainly would be very important to keep that in mind. But in terms of me discovering some additional information in this book, I didn't.
Yes, the question right there.
But can you tell us who you are?
So I'm a visiting researcher from Austria here at the Politics Institute. And I would like to add 2 or 3 things to this very interesting presentation on this topic. The first thing is one of the persons here addressed the history issue. I mean, one has to remind that the country like Ukraine, and there are lots of other countries as well, they didn't have challenges that deep-rooted after 1991. So the political elite or the elite of society did not change that much. So where do these oligarchs come from? They come out from a certain kind of structure which never ceased to be. So they just developed further in their time. And as you mentioned, Kuchma's blackmails, they developed it quite further, so to its own extent, of course. This is one thing, and the other thing is about atomic power stations. They have an inverse aspect in Ukraine because we have Chernobyl still there. And Ukraine is using it by means of politics as a pressure point to European Union, give us financial subsidies, otherwise we cannot assure that Chernobyl is not going to break out once again. So it's also a kind of energy going on the other side, or towards the other side. So
Kind of also political use of an energy threat, kind of, as well.
And then the simple technical question is, if the Ukraine is, if the Crimean area is really cut off, the Ukraine, where does the energy come from at the moment? I mean, they do not get the energy via the Strait of Kerch, so they get the energy from Ukraine. So there are still aspects of connecting with both by technical means. But how does this work actually?
Well, absolutely, and this could be actually one factor that could help call both sides, or especially the Russian side, to a more moderate position. Absolutely. Infrastructurally, Crimea is fully incorporated into Ukraine in terms of electricity, in terms of gasoline supplies, in terms of water. So it's going to be now. An independent Crimea, of course, can buy water and gas and oil and gasoline from Ukraine, of course, but it adds a higher level of complexity here. I want to go back to your first comment when you talked about the fact that those elites in these states did not face, I don't know how you put it, some real challenges after 1991. I think this is a key point.
They were not discussed in society, so they did not even change. They were not discussed in society itself, so they were just forgiven there. So there was no discussion, no discussion on the past on that level.
On the role of these.
On the role of these elites, yes. Wherever they are. So.
Yes. So I mean, let's remember that with the exception of Belarus, of Lithuania, there were not really gigantic economic changes in these states. You had a situation where some of those Soviet elites could continue, like Red Directors continue, later slowly transform into other elites. So there was really no traumatic event that would force those elites out of the picture and a new elite coming in. So I think that's a very important point here. Thank you.
the nuclear power question.
But yes, the nuclear, absolutely, that's a very important element, and this is again a situation where a state like Ukraine can use energy or the lack of energy, also in the manipulation. And or speaking of Chernobyl, of course, it would be kind of the threat of what could happen in Chernobyl if there's not enough funds to create a new sarcophagus, to create a new protective structure. But in a broader sense, what I found extremely interesting is what I call the instrumental use of energy dependency. If you look at the declarations of political leaders, starting with Mr. Kushner, there was a constant discussion of how terrible it was to be energy dependent. And in a way, you have these declarations going on saying, look how terrible it is that we are energy dependent. Look how terrible it is that Russia uses energy weapon against us. As a way of gaining some kind of brownie points, both with domestic constituencies and with external constituencies, EU, World Bank, IMF, while in reality pursuing very different policies. So kind of pursuing policies that were not leading either to more transparency or energy diversification, while rhetorically speaking of the danger of energy dependency to gain a certain political capital. And I think that's also a very interesting part of the story.
Yes, please.
You may have dealt with this and I may have missed it because I'm not so good here. Trocha Huli. I didn't say that very well. Anyway, the Financial Post the last couple of days, a writer devoted half a page. He said, Obama, if he let loose of all the American energy, come gas and oil, he'd bring the price down, strangle Russia and all the other energy-producing countries, and he would achieve something or other that he thought might be good to put Putin in his place. Now, I don't know if anybody else was aware of that, but I had read that, and I don't know if you have dealt with that this afternoon, and if you have, excuse me, I didn't get it, but would you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. So it was very interesting. This kind of came out very suddenly in the US press in just the last 4 days. So this is about two things. This is about increased US oil exports. It's about changing certain regulations, allowing the US to export oil to a broader set of consumers. And this is also about the US starting to export, again, changing regulations so that the US could start to export some of its unconventional gas, shale gas, to overseas markets through transforming this unconventional gas into liquefied natural gas. Okay, so this would be the idea that the US would export, in particular, more liquefied natural gas and help in the situation of dependency. This sounds very good, but there are two issues here. Okay? The first issue is that liquefied natural gas is expensive and actually can only exist as liquefied natural gas in a situation of high gas prices because it's so expensive to liquefy the gas, both economically and also calorically, if you wish. That can only happen in a situation where those prices are high. So for liquefied natural gas to play an important role or to be competitive, to be exported, we are talking about $700, $800 per thousand, per the equivalent of 1,000 cubic meters. And this is a very, very high price. Concerning oil, let's remember that a lot of this unconventional oil, and you live in Alberta, again, I shouldn't be telling you this, the price of producing a lot of this oil is increasing. So, yes, the US can export, may be able to export this liquefied natural gas and this unconventional oil, but it doesn't tell us that this is going to be inexpensive. And again, this brings back a larger question that we have seen in the past, especially when we are talking about European Union policies, but which now may become very key for US policy as well, the question of whether the state is going to subsidize those cheap oil and gas exports. So LNG at the equivalent of $700–800 per 1,000 cubic meters is not really going to change the equation, because you need these important states to be able and politically willing to pay for this. And this is not a foregone conclusion.
Can I just add two
Yes,
additional
yes,
factors
yes.
there that I think are very important to consider?
Yes.
Number one, in terms of looking at the facilities for liquefied natural gas, you don't build those in a year or two. So if you're talking about 10 or 15 years down the road, that's way past the history of what we're basically looking at now, is number one. The other thing, that there was a major write-up in a paper here just last week, I think it was, in terms of all of this hope that we're going to have the energy self-sufficiency from the shale gas. The discoveries now, with some of the experience that they're having, is that the production in a lot of these wells after the first year drops by somewhere from 40 to 60%. So this idea that we had of all of this surplus gas may not even materialize, regardless of the cost that you're looking at. So those are two other factors that I think need to be factored into this whole equation.
So the stories are a lot of gas too.
Yeah, well.
Yes, and if you have perhaps the citation for that you could give me later, that would be great, for that article that you are mentioning. Okay.
Yes,
but
please.
the larger question,
sorry.
that I want to just point, a lot of these policies that would be beneficial are going to be expensive. Not only about importing that LNG, but for example about getting rid of domestic subsidies. I spoke at the beginning of my talk about how some of those internal rents emerge or can emerge when you have a difference in the price between the price that certain types of fuel are charged domestically and others. If we look at some of the types of energy corruption under Yanukovych, they had to do exactly with the misuse of some of the subsidies. But for a government to eliminate subsidies is a very problematic issue politically. And for a weak government, like the transition government in Ukraine now, especially. So these are very, very difficult choices and very difficult questions.
Yes, please.
Governments are often chosen by money.
By money or by?
By money, in cash. You're talking about corruption of government around the resource issue. Well, Alberta for 43 years has been ruled by one majority government. There's been more democracy in other planets of the universe than here. But you've got big money running the government. And that's where the problems happen. And that's where any government of any stripe can be corrupted. Because as long as it takes more money than your opponent to get elected, you've got to be the government that attracts the most wealth and can manipulate it for your own corrupt way. And that's the problem. People aren't involved in resources, not even in Alberta. It's the big gas and oil companies and the politicians themselves. And that's the table they consult with.
Well, that's a very interesting comment. I look forward to spending more time in Alberta and learning more about Alberta. But what I want to say, that going back to a more academic perception of the issue, I want to write another book. And in this new book, I'm going to be thinking about different types of energy. And one thing that struck me from the Let Go is that some of the types of energy we normally think about, oil, gas, coal, these are energy commodities. Energy that can be bought and sold easily. But how about types of energy which are not commodities? How about energy that is produced and used locally? Wind energy, solar energy, if you don't transmit it, of course you can transmit it. Maybe relying on that kind of energy will lead to a very different set of power relations and economic relations. But
it
this is what we want.
Who has the money to put that energy into production so it's used by enough people to be a factor? That's again where the corruption raises its head.
Or maybe human nature is so that we will also find a way to engage corruption with solar energy, which I think already there is some of that.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to mention three things that I came across in my reading. I read Michael Clare, and I have been reading him for years.
I love his book. Very
yes,
good.
he's excellent. And I'm not sure if it was he that was writing about a pipeline that Russia is arranging to go underneath the sea, and it should be finished in 2015. And another point is that under the Oleska gas, where they got the concession, where Chevron got the concession, a Gazprom pipeline runs right under there. And another thing that I have read is that Poland is very busily developing their fracturing gas. Should be ready to go to be exported. And I also read that within 20 years, if they do the fracturing to get the gas out of Ukraine, it will be gone in 20 years. That's about as long as what they have there will last. And I think that was just looking at the Oleska part, not the part that is in the eastern provinces.
Okay, those are very, very interesting elements. Some of these things I didn't know about, like you were talking about the this one Gazprom pipeline that I...
Yeah, it goes under the Oleska Foundation in the west.
Okay.
And interesting.
Yes, I need to look into that as well. And I don't know if I need to respond to your comments, but these are very, very important points.
These are things that I have read.
Yes, and of course, Poland's growing energy self-reliance and energy self-confidence, I think, is going to be a very interesting element. Poland already is playing a very important role in the region as a supporter of Ukraine and a supporter of other states. A very important player also for another country we work on, Belarus, and this energy self-assuredness will certainly play an important role there as well.
And I could mention too that they were setting up for taking out the natural gas, not the natural gas, the fractured gas from Ukraine. The government was negotiating with Chevron and with Exxon and with Shell since about, way back 2000. There's a website, lawyer.com, where you can get the information from the legal groups that arrange the contracts.
Very good. I'm afraid if I go to lawyer.com, that's going to be expensive. Yeah. Because anything with lawyers is better. So I will.
And they finally signed, but they were arranging it from 2011 and before that, but they finally signed the contract with the government November 5th of 2013.
Yes. And this is very important also because it forces us to also reassess how we are looking at Yanukovych. Probably nobody in this room likes Yanukovych, but let's remember that a number of energy initiatives that, yes, were related to the higher prices charged by Russia, yes, were related to changes in the world economy, but a lot of those initiatives happened under Yanukovych. So as we consider not only the energy issue, but the larger set of Ukrainian-Russian relations, let's remember that it's not enough simply to think of Yanukovych as pro-Russian or as a marionette of Russia. That was a much more complex relationship. That doesn't make Yanukovych a nicer person, but we need to understand that because that helps us understand more about the interests at play in that larger relationship.
Yeah,
Please.
I'd just like to add another aspect of this discussion. So, coming from the European Union, we all know that Germany has a very heavy weight on politics at the moment. And by the end of the 1990s, this was just a period when Germany was mostly not depending on Russian politics at all, because they did not have that much import from energy there. And afterwards, they gained more and more energy from Russia, so they were depending on it. But what is interesting now is since 3 or 4 years after Fukushima, the German government tried to do this energy change politics, so they try to invest lots of money on wind energy, for instance, which they are going step by step to substitute imported gases from Russia. So this will change the politic attitude, or the attitude of the politicians towards Russia, I think, in Germany as well. And the other thing is, we are not talking about the situation in Ukraine. All the time, what is bothering me most being in Ukraine, and this is of course due to this special political situation of who is earning money from energy, nobody's talking about how to save energy in Ukraine. If you have ever been in a Ukrainian household, it's normal that the hot water, the boiled water is running all the time, because anyway you pay a standard fee for the month. Either you use a cubic meter or 100 cubic meters, the same price for them. So there's a lot of energy in Ukraine which is not fostered to be used by the government, cause all of this situation. They are not interested to do it because they have more money in trading in certain gas companies between Russia and Ukraine than to save them.
It's incredible because we have had this discussion exactly on these topics for 20 years. And it cannot take 20 years to put gas meters. By the way, speaking of gas meters, there were no gas meters on the Ukrainian side of the Ukrainian-Russian border until very recently.
It's not only a question of putting gasometers, it's also a question of how to shape the house buildings. And,
Yes, as well. Yes.
Change the
Also a question of the price structure and how the prices are charged and what are the incentives that are presented there.
To give an example, if you take today's Slovakia, they did a lot of it because they were depending very much on the Družba line. And they did a lot of investments by the state of isolating the houses in Bratislava, which saved them a lot amount of energy and money going otherwise to Russia back. So, yeah.
So again, this has to do with the different incentives for different groups, including the consumer and including the intermediaries in energy. So that's a very, very good point. And your point about wind energy and Germany becoming less dependent on Russian gas, absolutely. But in the meanwhile, while it's more dependent because gas is seen as a transition type of energy that helps kind of bridge the gap between nuclear and renewable.
I think I'm going to wrap up the formal part of the proceedings, but it doesn't mean everybody has to disperse. Let me just thank the speaker, Dr. Balmaceda, and our discussant, Dr. Robert Murray, all of you for attending and having an interest in this subject. And as well, I want to thank the people behind the scenes at the CIUS, Lydia Waring, Roman Shian, Peter Madalainen, and Volodymyr Krauchenko.